The collaboration just doesn't happen naturally. For diversity within groups, say for example, my CBI Council and the roundtables that we hold every quarter to get industry views, having women involved in that council is really important, and it doesn't happen naturally. Sometimes when I'm building up the council for the year ahead, I'm making phone calls in the background to people saying, why are you not putting yourself forward for this role, and making sure that I have the right level of diversity around that table. And it's not just females, as you say, it's about diversity of thought. I want people there from different sectors. I want manufacturing people there, I want business services there, IT people there, retail people there. And I just don't want, big, large companies. I want the small companies around the table. They have a different view on what's best for the economy. And it could be from foreign direct investors to Indigenous companies.
Around the Table is an Illuminaire podcast hosted by John Healy and me, Karise Hutchinson. This podcast is powered by Nuida, developing the next generation of leaders. For over 2 decades, Nuida has partnered with the world's leading financial institutions and technology firms to build the skills, mindsets, and confidence their people need to lead in a digital world. From early career engineers to senior executives, their expert-led training programs help organizations accelerate transformation, adopt AI, and deliver real business impact. Learn more at nuida.com.
Welcome to this week's conversation around the table. I am really excited about this word because it is fundamental to leadership today, and that is collaboration. And we have got a super guest who is here to talk to us about collaboration. We're joined today by Angela McGowan, who is the director for Northern Ireland at the CBI and has been in that role for about 10 years now. So a lot of experience, in her own leadership journey, but also in terms of interaction with leadership teams right across the economy. Collaboration sounds like a simple word, and we hear so much about it. Karise, we hear people talking about co-creating and the collaborating that's going on, but actually there's not as much of it out there. We see it all the time in terms of projects where people are talking a good story on collaboration, but maybe not in terms of the delivery, actually delivering against it. And we're going to dig into that a bit in the conversation around the table here today, around how we can be more collaborative and what it takes to build teams. Like I know myself in my journey, the success that I've had on my leadership journey has been all about the team. It has been about building the right teams, getting teams to work together in a much more efficient way. And really, to achieve success in leadership, you have to be able to collaborate. And I think it'd be really useful for us, Karise, if maybe before we start this conversation around the table on collaboration, if you could define it for us.
Yeah. So this is a second word around the table, and it's probably, John, on the face of it, a much more positive word. We hear it quite a lot. It is highly valued right through, if you think from recruitment into an organization, how we promote people into leadership roles. So it is definitely it's a big word and absolutely critical. There are lots of different definitions out there, like there are with all of these words. And like I've said before, I think we need to be really careful about what we're not talking about today. We're not talking about ticking a teamwork box. Okay, we're not talking about that. We're not talking about a leader who wants to pursue a false sense of peace or harmony. And we're not talking about foregoing responsibility. I think we're talking about actually a word that is hard work in its essence. And we are talking about what it means to have a collaborative mindset. It's a skill. It's something that actually prioritizes this in other people, and it requires great emotional intelligence. But we're going to talk much more about the science later. But essentially, we need to remember today that it is also hard work, and there's another C, and it's conflict. And how do we actually deal with that? It's all part of it. But I know we're going to unpack that later.
Oh, Chris, I love that. And I totally agree with you whenever you talk about the definition being the collaboration isn't some sort of synonym for harmony. And there's a fantastic book Lencioni's
That's
book,
right.
5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And the quote from that I love is that the absence of conflict isn't harmony,
That's
it's
right.
apathy. And really that's where, you've got to reflect on, getting that collaboration right and really getting energy into the system, and not substituting a bit of conflict and being
Yeah.
able to disagree agreeably. So, Angela, it is an absolute pleasure
Thank you, John.
to have you with us. We've asked all of our guests to bring along an object or a piece of art, or maybe talk about a book or something else that has resonated with you on your journey in leadership. And I am really looking forward to hearing what you brought along for us and what it means to you. So,
Okay.
Angela, welcome.
Thank you very much, Karise, John. It's great to be here today, and it is a real honour to be asked to be speaking on this subject. So today I brought along a little bit of artwork. It's by a local artist, Stephen Farron. Many of you might know him. He has a studio in Belfast, and he sketches these most delightful sketches onto porcelain tiles. And the reason I felt that it resonated with me around collaboration and myself is, I mean, I actually am very keen on art myself, and it's something that I used to do a lot of painting. I haven't done it since I started my job in the bank in 2008. I haven't painted at all, and it's something I plan to get back to. It uses the right side of your brain, and I've actually recently bought a book on drawing from the right side of the brain, and it's important for that diversity. When you're collaborating, you want to hear different ideas. The sketch on this one is actually Queen's University, and it was given to me as part of participating in a collaborative project that they did around celebrating the 25 years of the Good Friday Agreement, and where I chaired a panel session. I was saying to you earlier that I actually wish that I had both universities on it, because I think both universities in Northern Ireland are really exemplar institutions for showing how collaborative works, not just within their own structures, but they really do reach out to the business community, they reach out to government, they're involved in communities, and that collaboration from the universities is very important as well. So that's why this resonated to me as a
It's
piece
a beautiful
bring today.
object, and really does encapsulate the spirit of collaboration. Interestingly, as you talked there, you talked about your own painting and using a different part of your brain, and diversity is a big part of the building of successful teams and collaboration. And that diversity can be cultural, it could be cognitive, like there's all sorts of different dimensions to it.
Yeah.
So it's critical for innovation and high performance within teams, but can be also very challenging for leaders today. And that is even compounded further by the fact that we're not always together. So you're dealing across different kind of media and hybrid teams and so on. What have you learned on your journey in your way through in terms of how to build those kind of diverse teams and work across diverse teams, in your role today as the director for Northern Ireland for the CBI, or reaching back into your time in other organisations?
So for me, and obviously for the CBI, it's about representing a collective view
right.
to government. We want to bring government solutions that aren't just one perspective. We want to bring, here's a collection of views, and this is the best way forward around the table. So for me, John, it's really important. The collaboration just doesn't happen naturally. For diversity within groups, say, for example, my CBI Council and the roundtables that we hold every quarter to get industry views, having women involved in that council is really important, and it doesn't happen naturally. Sometimes when I'm building up the council for the year ahead, I'm making phone calls in the background to people saying, why are you not putting yourself forward for this role, and making sure that I have the right level of diversity around that table. And it's not just females, as you say, it's about diversity of thought. I want people there from different sectors. I want manufacturing people there. I want business services there, IT people there, retail people there. And I just don't want, big, large companies. I want the small companies around the table. They have a different view on what's best for the economy. And it could be from foreign direct investors to Indigenous companies. So having that kind of diversity of thought around and getting collaboration with that level of diversity, it takes a bit of work, and you really have to plan in advance the meetings that you want to have and who should be around that table and how do we pull everybody in, and certainly for getting the different views within, or within the minutes and within the meetings, and what we're going to take back as our policy recommendations. I think it's really good. I like to do round robin. I like to try and pull as many people in as I possibly can. And I do chair like a lot of roundtables, and I know there's quiet voices and then there's very loud voices, and it's about giving people the time. The dominant voice in the room, and your go-to people as well who'll be able to start the conversation. They're very confident. They've years of service, and they know exactly what they want to say. But it's making sure that you go back to the quieter voice and saying, such and such. Would you concur with that? We haven't heard from you today. What are your thoughts on this? And for me as well, I've always used the tactic maybe just before a meeting or getting the team actually even in advance to say, send them an email and ask them, are they prepared to talk about this in the meeting? Send people the questions in advance and saying to them, look, we're really going to be discussing this. This is the paper, but can you think about this for your organisation before you come to the table? I think that really helps to bring out those diverse voices within the conversation.
As you talk there, it's not just about the meeting. It's not just about the production of an artifact in front of you. It's all of that preparation. And sometimes we forget that collaboration is difficult. It's time consuming. You've got to put the effort in to get the reward out.
Yeah, it doesn't happen naturally. You really have to organise it, and you have to make sure in the background that your meeting is going to go in that direction.
Yeah, and collaboration too. It's give and take. It's about winning some of those arguments and taking the wins when they're presented, but also it's about giving way. So how do you help in the conversation? You've got a diverse membership. And everybody can't necessarily get everything all of the time. How do you manage that in terms of identifying the true priority in relationships and then being able to push things forward?
Yeah, I mean, you're always trying to push for the consensus view, and the more people you bring in, the easier it is. If you have a view that's very different to everybody else, the more people you bring in, it becomes obvious, I think, at the end of a meeting. Like, this is probably the most straightforward way forward. It's probably the most sensible way forward. I think probably, though, acknowledging the people in the room who have a different view and saying and thanking them for bringing that different perspective, and that is something we all have to bear in mind. So I think it's important to make them feel valued despite the fact that they're not going with the consensus, and given that psychological space that you don't have to agree with everybody else around the table. Your thoughts are welcome, your opinions are welcome. Today it probably doesn't fit right because it's not about the you're testing an idea, you're not testing the person.
That's right.
And so you really want to look at what works for this mission that we're on, what works for this, what's the solution for this particular task. So I think it's giving respect to the different opinions, even if they're not going to be your consensus choice of the way forward.
Yeah, so you're talking there about managing disagreement, and sometimes people can be adverse to conflict. People shy away from it.
Yeah.
So in your experience, how do you help to bring about agreement whenever sometimes there is that disagreement, whenever there is that kind of tension, and how can leaders out there listening today think about how they might manage, to be able to deal with conflict, but also then to be able to resolve it?
I mean, I think it's always good to go back to why are we all sitting here?
That's right.
What is the outcome that we want to achieve? We're all here for a particular reason. We all think, there's a solution that we're all trying to get to. There's a problem we're trying to solve, or there's, a problem that we're trying to create potential solutions to, and what we should put forward. So I think always bringing people back to the reason that we're in the room is really important, because and I think the importance of being valued within that conversation, even if it's not, and as I say, being polite to people, welcoming different ideas, and it is always good to have the challenge, John. I mean, the whole, somebody saying to you, that data doesn't work, the time frames aren't good, that is a good thing to have in the room, because it does bring us all back to, look, what can we actually achieve? So you're trying to encourage the kind of, the more kind of questioning, the critical friend is what you want to be, and where you want people around the table to be a critical friend who'll raise objections, but they know it's not a personal thing. This is about work. It's not about the person themselves.
Yeah, but you just can't pick the telephone up to somebody and say today, "Oh, would you be my critical friend?" That takes quite a bit of effort in front to build relationships. So, as you go about your leadership, how much do you invest in relationships? Maybe that you're not getting anything from today, but maybe that you might need to ring to be your critical friend somewhere down the line. Like, is that part of how you conduct your business?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I think about, having people around the table or collaborating, I think probably I have quite good relationships. In Northern Ireland, it is a lot of personal relationships. I think, you know, being vulnerable, picking up the phone to somebody when you're stuck. Things don't happen the way you want them to happen, and you're in a situation. You're just being honest about this. I can't control this situation. Maybe, a speaker for an event has decided 2 days before to pull out. Being able to phone up people, and instead of thinking of yourself as being a weak leader or the situation, I'm not able to control it, being vulnerable with somebody saying, I need help here. And I think people will actually always kind of rise to the challenge. I think probably a lot of the people that I deal with, John, have no problems expressing themselves as critical friends.
Okay.
Many chief executives, they know exactly what they want. They know, I mean, for example, in my job, I get paid to represent people, to represent their views, and they're not one bit shy of telling you if they feel it could be done a different way, or we need to step up in another way, or, here's how it's done. So, and I suppose I'm kind of fortunate in that way, but probably for the collaboration to work well, and this is something that you learn in your kind of leadership journey, that I'm actually there to serve them. So, and they know that, and they're paying me a fee to work for them, to try and make the policy out there in the economic landscape more conducive for business, raising their challenges with government. And I feel that the kind of relationship, and that's the way our organisation works, that they can very openly be critical friends.
I can see Karise is busting to get in and ask some questions. But before I hand over to you, Karise, as I'm listening to him, I'm thinking of you in your role where you're the director here in Northern Ireland, but you sit within that wider network of the CBI. You're part of a network on the island of Ireland and into Europe. So you've got multiple dimensions that you're operating on, and many of our listeners, leaders in businesses are leading their organization that might be part of a group that's selling and dealing with organizations in a global way. So, as you think about those kind of multi-dimensions that you're operating in, like, do you have any particular practices or ways that you think about your leadership and collaborating in those different types of constructs?
And I guess it is a different type. You have to be quite agile and collaborate in different ways with the different stakeholders. And you mentioned the CBI in London, for example. I mean, the difference in terms of how I collaborate with them is different because they're not on the ground. I'm not sitting around the table with them on a regular basis. A lot of the conversations are done over Teams. A lot of the policy happens in London, and having to keep up with it, etc. And I do always remember, actually, John, sitting in a round table with you in the past, and we had somebody over talking about digital skills, and they started to talk about what they're doing in England, and I interrupted and said, look, I don't want to be selfish here, for time, but because we're in Northern Ireland, I'm going to be a bit selfish and ask us to focus on what's happening in Northern Ireland. And you interrupted and said, don't be apologising for it.
Yeah, look, and my own leadership, like I've led within a group, so I've had my entity to look after, which is part of a global organization, and you sometimes do have to think about the collaboration that you're doing across your own part of the organization and not maybe the wider piece as well.
And it can be tricky because, obviously as a stakeholder, government is a stakeholder, and trying to collaborate with them as well. And just, you have to be very careful about, you have to be a critical friend, but you can't, sometimes those conversations behind closed doors are more important than the outward messages or outward criticisms. It's easier to go behind, speak to a special advisor, speak to one of the policy officials and say, look, this is where we have a bit of a problem. This is what the business community is saying. Do you realise this is being said? How are you going to deal with it? So sometimes, as you say, the collaboration happens in a very different forum, and it varies according to who you're actually dealing with.
Karise, very much the idea behind these conversations around the table is because leadership is difficult, you know, and leaders come to leadership thinking that hey, this is going to be easy, and it's not. And collaboration, you know, we all want to do it, but it's not easy.
And I think I'm just reflecting on what you were saying, Angela, and essentially for listeners, we're talking about influence here. And I suppose what we're seeing is a big shift away from the ego to the eco. So when it comes to collaboration, the ego's sort of traditional stance was direct command control. I say, therefore you do. That sense of hierarchy. But I think, Angela, your story will strike such a note with listeners, because for so many, leaders are trying to influence beyond their own hierarchy or within their own structures.
Yeah.
They're influencing, and to me, collaboration is a really it's a way of push and pull influences. It's a way of not pushing it on people, but pulling people into a conversation. So it makes me think about that inner work in us as leaders. How do we have a readiness? Because we all know there's some people that are just naturally more collaborative, or much more thinking about the kind of wider sense of purpose, and there are others that might be more protective. So what about that inner work? What do you feel has been important in your learning and your journey?
Yeah, and I think inner work, I mean, I like to read, like people like Carl Jung would talk about your shadow side.
That's right.
Your inner work is your shadow side, and it's being aware of it. And I think that comes easier as you get older. And if you look back to whenever you were maybe a younger leader,
Absolutely.
there was more ego involved. Yeah, because you're new into this, you think, oh, with authority, I'm supposed to have all the wisdom. And it's only as time goes on, you realize authority and wisdom are not the same thing. You are there to bring out the wisdom in others. But yeah, it's that old saying, you know, if you wanna go far, you go. If you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together.
That's right.
So shadow work is really important, and knowing yourself and knowing your flaws. And everybody has a shadow side, and nobody, you know, is all knowing. Nobody is all perfect.
That's right.
And being able to identify the things in yourself, whether it's something like impatience, or if you're under pressure in particular, you know, when do these emotions come out that you want things done fast? You know, you're probably less open to listening to people. You're probably trying to make fast decisions. You're wanting everything yesterday. And it's understanding that that is your bad side that you've got to put away. But my advice to young people coming up is, don't just think about looking at your shadow side and work. Look at it in your whole life. And I think probably as you get older and you start to ask those big questions about life and yourself and your spirituality and, you know, what kind of a person are you, it's really good to work on this in everyday life.
Yes.
And I mean, I've read that book, Ego is the Enemy, and I can't remember who it is, who wrote it, sorry, but we could
We'll look that up and get
that's an
material
amazing,
afterwards.
that's an amazing book, and every young person should read it. And because then they start to realize when their ego is talking, and they see it in other people, you know, they'll see the person around the board table, and instead of being maybe intimidated by the person that's, you know, competing for airtime but not saying all the right things, you know, they start to be able to see how it works and see it with themselves. And then practicing it in your own daily life means it's very easy then to do in the workplace. So, you know, even, you know, you might go into the coffee shop in the morning and, you know, the barista isn't very friendly. They look at you, they turn and make the coffee, they just put it down and wait, you don't know, no conversation or smiles. And, you know, the older me would have thought, just rude, you know, can I be rude back? I'll not speak either. I'll just walk off. The older me now, you know, internally laughs at the situation. That's not about you. You know, it's not all about you, Angela. This is somebody's had a really
transference
bad morning, you know. So, you know, and being able to do that in everyday life and practice that in everyday life makes it much, much easier to see where your impatience is or where your problems lie, and then to be able to address it.
I think that's a really interesting idea that you brought up, though, this idea that, you know, leaders think that they have to be somebody different in a leadership role, as opposed to being their authentic self, you know, and the energy that's lost out of the system through that incongruence is huge. You know,
We'll be talking about that, Angela. We have another word on the table to come, and that's around purpose. And I think that really is, we're known as that why. And I think that's what you said, was like remembering why we sit around this table.
Absolutely.
And one of the things that strikes me is that the real power, the positive energy of collaboration comes through trust. And you mentioned Patrick Lencioni, but like, you know, for us to have the conflict or that constructive discord that he talks about, the foundation is trust. And I think a lot of what you're saying is how we build trust in order for collaboration. And do you have any tips on trust? You know, especially whenever maybe leaders are thinking beyond their own organization.
Yeah, and I think the trust comes from people seeing you in your own vulnerable, you know, your own vulnerable state, seeing you recognizing your own faults and being able to laugh at them. People start to trust you when they see you being, you know, more your authentic self. And I think as well, always creating that, and I mentioned it earlier, that psychological safety for people in the room where they don't feel judged. And, you know, when people make a mistake and, you know, how we treat that mistake. I always had a saying that my dad would have said, the person who never made a mistake never made anything. And I think when people make a mistake, you have to think, they tried, it didn't work. I've made so many mistakes, and you have to be forgiving, and people have to understand they're working in that dynamic where if it doesn't go the way it should have gone, it's not going to be held against them personally.
Absolutely.
It all comes back to, as you say, that mission, that purpose, why we're all here. Everybody's doing their best, but how do we get collaborating to make that work? So I think the trust comes from the psychological safety to be yourself within the team. It also comes, again, I think, also from knowing your role within the team.
That's right.
And the importance of your role in the team.
Absolutely.
And we talked a minute earlier about kind of knowing your strengths and your weaknesses. And I know one of my weaknesses is I'm a kind of strategic person. I think big picture and wanting to get to the outcome. I hate process. You know, the minutiae of details. The minutiae of details and how things get done. And you have to learn, as you get older, you learn, instead of, you know, when my younger self in a room would have thought, oh, here we go, they're going to give us all the details of why it's, you know, whatever. Now you recognise that person has a really important role. You need the process people.
And that is collaboration writ large there. You know, it's about finding the right person for that role and surrounding yourself
the people that are
with
not you.
people like that, exactly, who bring in the other parts that aren't you. So if you're the big picture, you find the detail person.
And I think then it's really important to show the respect for that person with the team, going, look, you know, you're obviously really on top of that. This is great that you're doing that job. So look, I'm just going to leave it with you, and you know, come back to me if you have problems along the way. And so it's about, you know, not wanting to not listen to the minutiae in a meeting, but also, you know, giving the respect, giving them the time that they need to express and making them feel valued. And I think that helps to build up the trust as well.
Yeah. So, Karise, your publication, Illuminaire, it's all about bringing the science, the strategy, the story to the leadership conversations. And that includes the conversation that we're having around the table here today about collaboration. So we've heard Angela talk about her story, talk about her experiences. But what does the science tell us? What does your research show?
So the first, suppose, major headline I think we need to be aware of as we're listening is, why is collaboration important now? So just to kind of like, we are in this grey zone. John, we've been talking around the table on this. This is a time of great uncertainty, of great complexity. And the complexity that we encounter as leaders cannot be met with simplicity. We need to release the collective intelligence. Leaders must understand that we do not hold all the answers. Angela's told us that today, but the research really is absolutely fundamentally clear. And there was a great piece by Oxford University that actually talks about that ego to eco. And they talk about that actually the knowledge and the wisdom that exists in those networks, those collective capabilities, is paramount to leading right now in the grey zone. So it does mark that shift away from that sort of heroic figure of the leader in terms of that more the power that rests in the ecosystem. And secondly, the research tells us about the benefits. We have seen that. I mean, the research confirms a lot of we recruit for it. So we're always looking at how do we do that? How do we actually get people that are collaborative? We don't want people that are fundamentally ruled by their super ego.
Yeah.
We want them to have that ability. And that's about emotional intelligence. So it starts again, we hear a lot around these conversations about self-awareness, but the research is then that if you're not self-aware as a leader and you don't understand, you said about the shadow side, then we're not going to be able to relate and connect with other people. And that is around that relationship building capacity. But one of the really clear pieces of evidence that's really emerging now, you talked about cognitive or neurodiversity, that actually the research tells us that less able diverse groups generally find more workable solutions than those that are more expert or homogenous. And that's a really powerful headline right there. So are we surrounding ourselves just with the experts and with those that hold the qualification? And what other views are we having around the table? And then the third and final headline, John, that I wanted to share is really around, it hits back to that sense of influence and where and how we influence from. And I think leaders need to realize that there's two sides to the coin. We're thinking about how do we influence other people? But the research, there's a great article in the Harvard Business Review that talks about, are we willing to be influenced by other people? That's what collaboration is essentially about. And this sense of being ready for anything as leaders, we see the headlines, leaders need to be all things and ready for everything. And we need to realize that in this world of AI and all of the great technological advancement, the need for human-centered leadership has never been greater. And that is requiring a big shift for leaders, because often we are promoting leaders into really senior positions because of maybe technical expertise or specific qualifications. But do they actually have those human-centered collaborative skills? That involves conflict resolution, the ability to actually, Patrick Bloom talks about cooking the conflict, but can we actually, it's not about coordinating and compliance, it's actually about collaboration. And one of the things I think we've been writing about recently in terms of Illuminaire, and I'll finish with this, is talking about the societal shift that we've made thanks to technology, where they're removing friction. That's another word for discomfort. So we don't even have to tell people what we want. Our devices are telling us what we want. The ease from which we can get food. And all of this is actually this wholesale removal of friction. If we pull that into collaboration, any sign, even a sniff of friction, people are all out.
People bristle.
They bristle, and then they won't actually embrace what Patrick Lencioni says. So I think we need to pay attention and be aware of that actually there is a power in friction. And if we remove it from our teams, we remove really that sense of collaboration that brings the high performance, John.
Yeah, the absence of conflict is not harmony, it's apathy. And we've got to guard against that as leaders.
Yes.
And that brings us back to that human-centered approach that you talk about and the great need for it today. And my takeaway from this conversation is ego to eco.
Yes.
It really isn't about you as a leader. It's about that system of collaboration that you're able to build. So we know the science is compelling. We have explored some of the places, some of the practices that we as leaders and people listening to the podcast might want to reflect on in terms of their leadership journey. But Angela, for all of these conversations, we'd like to leave our guests with the final word around the table. So Angela, what would you say to leaders who want to embrace collaboration more fully but are wary of all of those complexities that we have illuminated today? Where can they start?
I think know thyself is the starting point. Know yourself. Know your ego. Learn to work with your ego as like a separate entity. Learn to see where it emerges and then laugh at it and put it back in its place. Because I think whenever you're driven by ego, you're going to surround yourself with yes men. You're not wanting to be challenged and you're going to fail. So bring in... Keep the curiosity is the other thing. I think, ask those questions, hear from different people. I mentioned all the people I have to collaborate with. I forgot to say, actually, young and old, really interesting to hear different people's perspectives as well. So I think that, that keep the curiosity, keep your ego in check, know yourself, and it's about humility as well, recognizing that within teams, people have their strengths and weaknesses, but everybody can bring something to the table, and how do you best get that out of them?
Wow.
Angela, that's fantastic. So we've got all the C's there. So for collaboration, you've got to challenge yourself, you've got to have curiosity, and you've got to check your ego. Angela, it's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for coming and joining us
Thank you.
around the table. Karise, as ever, thank you for bringing that expertise from academia to the conversation around the table. And thanks very much to all of our listeners for joining us for this conversation about collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much, Angela. Many thanks to David Glendenning, an artist from Northern Ireland who provided the soundtrack for this podcast show.